Welcome to the Clearwater video series Plan to Collaborate, where we talk about how collaboration can be done well to achieve greater benefits for your community or organization through integrated planning. Now, we get asked lots of questions about collaboration, how it can be done well, and we thought we'd tackle a few of them just through a bit of conversation. Some of the trickier ones often work better that way. So I thought we would start with one of the questions that comes up a lot and is one of the sort of trickiest, which is, how do we monitor and evaluate collaboration and ensure accountability?
A tricky one indeed. I think one of the biggest reasons why it's tricky to begin with is because when we're talking about the nature of collaboration, we're automatically talking about emergent outcomes. So as people get together and start working together, you can't predict the outcomes. That's kind of par for the course for collaboration. So when you're starting a project and you're getting a strong sense for what you might be able to create together, what you should do together, you might start to feel like, okay, we know what it is, we're getting a feel for what it is that we need to monitor. The challenge comes when a few more steps down your journey, things change. And suddenly the frameworks, the evaluation approach you've developed or the measures you've come up with are no longer valid because the ground has shifted underneath your feet. That's pretty much the standard for collaboration.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So in that context, one of the tools that we use a lot, we call a maturity model. It's a pretty simple concept in that typically as a group collaborates, it's bringing an increased maturity to the environment, maturity of capability to the environment it's operating in, but it's also bringing an increased maturity within itself as a collaborative group. It's able to deliver and produce more the more it works together. So one of the things that we do is on the outset of a project, as a collaborative exercise, mapping out on a whiteboard how many years is this going to take, or how many months is this going to take, and what are the big stages of maturity we're anticipating gaining through this process. And once you kind of get a few of those kind of slices mapped out, then that provides a much more robust framework to situate within that milestones or goals, those sorts of things are much likely to be framed in an appropriate way. It just gives them context, basically, that tends to play out a bit more in a way that is a bit more realistic in a collaborative context. So once you've got a maturity model in place, and that can be quite detailed or it can be very high level, then going through a collaborative process of trying to pop into those stages of maturity, what milestones or goals you think you might be able to achieve, and then backing out once again, how do you quantify those, would be a kind of a standard approach we would take, recognizing that then at each of those given stages or at key points through that process, you're going to need to refine and rework the model, most likely because of what's emerged through the process.
I find it really helpful to distinguish between phases in a maturity model versus sort of stages in a project plan, is that phases of maturity are quite transformative. I like to use a kind of metaphor of a butterfly. You know, it starts off as a little egg, then it's a larva, then it goes into its cocoon, then it hatches and becomes a butterfly. So think about the maturity of your collaboration as, you know, sort of transforming through all of those. And it is because of the sometimes radical nature of those transformations that makes it so hard to set your evaluation framework at the beginning.
Yeah, that's right. And one more point on accountability in this context, which is tricky yet again for different reasons. Typically, if you're a really flat collaborative group, which is often the case when you're dealing with multiple organizations, then it can be hard to kind of go, well, that person's responsible for this, or this organization's responsible for that. So the kind of the gold standard in collaborative contexts is to self-nominate into what you basically feel you could or should be responsible for. So if you get people going through the co-creation process, and if somebody really kind of owns a particular outcome or milestone or objective because they feel passionate about it and they're really engaged in it, then they're probably going to put up their hand to go, okay, I'll take on that side from a responsibility perspective. And that's usually how the accountability kind of flows out of it. It's certainly not, I as project manager am going to assign you to this or that or the other. It just usually doesn't get a very good outcome. I don't know what you think.
No, that's good. I mean, I think I might actually go to a related question.
Yeah.
How do we attend to the relationships between different policies, plans, and regulations? I guess what this question is really speaking to is when we're in a planning context, there's the plan we're focused on, but there's any number of other frameworks, policies, plans that are related, connected, sitting above, sitting below. How do those all kind of fit together?
Well, typically in this context, we're dealing with multiple organizations. Multiple organizations with multiple plans, policies that have been developed in different contexts and from different perspectives. And it's that context and perspective that we find is often key to really bringing these things into alignment. So one technique that we've often used is called individual perspectives. If you do a bit of Googling, you'll probably find some methods around this. But in concept, it's very simple. The idea is that you get different groups to speak from their own perspective on a particular topic or subject. So for example, you might be looking at how you might align a number of policies, each organization having their own, and getting each or providing the opportunity for each organization to speak to that policy from their own context and perspective. How did it arise? What are the most important aspects to it? What are the elements that they feel would be most easily misunderstood or overlooked by others outside of their organization? And then providing a structured environment where each group can move through presenting in a similar way, maybe answering common questions, so everybody's answering the same type of question in relation to their policy. And then as you go, ideally, capturing those outputs, say, on a whiteboard or something along those lines, so you can have a very strong, well-supported discussion afterwards. Then typically gaps, differences, and alignments will stand out very strongly.
So you've told us about an activity that generates alignment between the different perspectives represented by all these different policies and plans. Why does alignment matter?
Well, fundamentally, if we're talking about a collaborative enterprise or a collaborative activity, alignment of understanding is fundamentally what will underpin pretty much all activity, all outputs or outcomes that are developed. Ultimately, collaboration is reliant upon shared vision, as in that's the kind of the goalposts that the group sets their minds on and they work towards. But nobody can set a goalpost, and they certainly can't do it collaboratively or collectively unless they understand what a goalpost is or what the game is, and that's all about that kind of alignment of understanding. Another approach that you can take when you're seeking to understand the potential for alignment between different regulations and policies is to simply do an initial desktop analysis of them. This is a task that you can give somebody. Your collaborative group can provide that into, say, an individual or a small working group to say, here are the documents that we need to understand. And then a smaller group or even an individual is sometimes better placed to do a quick sweep across them all and present back to the group, here's what we found, here are the big gaps, here are the big alignments. And that can save a group a whole lot of time and confusion, especially if you provide the individuals in that group the opportunity to say, I think you might have missed this, and then here's the context and background for why we created that in the way that we did. So it's always important to remember that the work that a group undertakes, it's kind of it burns energy, and there's only so much gas in the tank, really. Yeah. And so looking for ways to really push the group further by individual work or breakout work is really valuable.
And I think what this piece of work often looks like is what's common to policies, strategies, frameworks is that they usually have some goals or outcomes or benefits projecting into the future, a new future reality. It's that shared vision. And there's a lot of existing tools out there, things like program logic and multiple benefits frameworks. There's probably stuff in your organization that you've used before along these lines. So again, it's the kind of intensive work that you want to get a separate group to do, but use those tools and get it visualized and get something for the group to bounce off of. Yeah. Okay, here's a really fundamental question in collaboration, which is how do we manage conflicting values?
Thinking back, I remember one particular project. We were working for a state government park management organization, and the challenge was to bring co-creation to a regional park management plan, a significant portion of the state, in fact, which covered a lot of area where there were many different types of park users, clearly with different values involved. So there was cattle grazers, four-wheel drivers, bushwalkers, horseback riders. I think there was at least 10 different park usages represented by clearly different community groups that were going to have different values coming to this. And the strategy that we took was to try and bring in early on voices that could participate from outside of the planning context, but that would be reputable and credible, hopefully to all involved. So, for example, I can't remember which park it was, but it was something along the lines of Yellowstone. Somebody involved knew somebody. They're a park ranger from Yellowstone, or one of those really big parks that pretty much everybody knows, and brought them into the mix early, so that if there was a flashpoint where we had different groups saying, well, we think it should work this way or that way, then these voices could kind of come in and say, well, how we solved it at Yellowstone was and it'd be hard to argue saying, oh, well, you don't know what you're talking about in that context. And I can't say for sure that strategy completely worked, but I don't remember there being any of those flashpoints, so hopefully it contributed.
Well, maybe the principle is not so much bringing in authority to tell us the answer, but it's give us an opportunity to see our unique values conflict through a different lens.
Right.
Right. Another way to kind of put it outside of us, as we often talk about externalizing the issue and getting it outside, so that we can have maybe a more elevated and a little bit less kind of hot conversation about it.
That's right. So, and if somebody's kind of speaking to it from that once removed situation, well, here's how we addressed it over here. It's like yours, but it's different than your situation. Then there's less of a concern probably around vested interests or alignment with this community viewpoint or that one. So
what do you do if you're in a situation and you don't have access to that, or you're not quite sure, the values conflict is heating up? What's your advice?
Well, slow down. So just like you would in a car, if suddenly you're driving and the steering wheel starts jiggling or something weird vibration happens, or you hear some strange sound, you don't just go, it'll be fine, and keep driving. Typically the instinct is, whoa, slow down, take the foot off the gas, and start looking for a place to pull over. Same in a collaborative context. Things can go sideways, pun intended, very quickly in a collaborative situation, so it's best just to take a break, take a pause, check in with everybody. If emotions start running hot, as they often do in anything that involves value differences, slow down, check in, try and engage people in a conversation around diagnosing the issue. Is there an issue here? What is the nature of this issue? What are the elements involved? Get it out again, so it's not associated with an individual. So you're talking about the ideas, not the people. And as you do that, especially if you're facilitating, find yourself in this situation, or if you don't have a facilitator and you need to jump into that situation, try to take it in a couple of pieces. So, diagnosis would be one piece, treatment could be another piece, even just slowing down can be a piece. Like, let's take 5. Just take a break. Let the emotions kind of cool, and that goes equally if you're online or in face-to-face situations. We've seen that play out in both respects. So take 5, try and diagnose, then come up and try and co-design with the group a particular treatment or solution or approach.
And I'd say if this is likely to be a big part, or it's emerging as a big part of what's going on in your planning process, then consider hiring that external facilitator. Having that neutral person can really help with distrust issues, especially if they don't really trust that you have their best interests in mind, if you're in the role of the person facilitating the larger process, that you might have an agenda. Also, from a more personal standpoint, is that often we go, well, the values conflict is over there, but just having that moment to check in with yourself and how's my worldview and my value system sort of speaking through me in a way that maybe I'm not fully appreciating, because sometimes the problem is you, actually. You need to check in with that.
Yeah.
Okay, so another common question in these days of social media and, breaking hierarchies and different forms of communication is, how do we bridge the bottom and the top of our organizations despite power differences between the two?
Yeah, another good question. In the first instance, always start with the question why. Why are we doing this? What value do we expect from bridging the top and the bottom? And sometimes that's very self-evident, but it isn't always. Sometimes it's just an assumption that you need to do that. Once you have a baseline premise for why you need to bring these groups together, you can expand on that using a method we call the double-sided value proposition, which is very simple. You just basically develop a value proposition for why you want an individual or a group involved, and then why you think they would want to be involved. And in this context, it would be useful, I think, to do it for both parties. So you go, why do we want the bottom involved? Why would they want to be involved? And then similarly for the top. And then in that way, you're able to engage them, entice them into the collaboration, so to speak, by speaking to their perspectives. Because especially when it comes to the top, it's hard to get their time and attention. Okay. And when it comes to the bottom, actually, it can be very similar. It's like, well, why do you need me in this context? And am I going to be exposing myself to my superiors in this way? Could that just put me in a worse situation if I'm critical of them than I was before? So leading with that value proposition can be very strong, a strong way to get them into the room.
Yeah, and then once you've got them there, you need to create the conditions for it to be both safe and productive. And I think you have to think about that differently. So people at the top, it's their job to see the big picture, to hold the big picture, and to kind of steer us in a particular direction. It's their job to have the answer. So when you're telling them, actually, it's your job to listen to the answer potentially coming from somewhere else, that's a bit of a mental shift. And so it's about kind of a coaching and getting them to actually be really ready to invite answers as they come in, and also to be ready to do something really authentically, take those answers and let them influence the outcome. So thinking about how that fits in with business processes and strategy and just decision making overall, resourcing. How are those answers going to actually, get into practice? And for people at the bottom, again, they're focused on their narrow area, so they might have a great idea, but they don't necessarily see it in the broader context. They can't frame it the right way. They're not necessarily using the right words and language. So how can we, in advance, take everything that the people at the top know and kind of reveal that in a big picture, or in some sort of in a brief, sort of saying, this is where we're looking at, this is what we're focused on, and this is the kind of responses we're looking for.
Yeah, and similarly, in advance, setting up those at the top to be ready to hear from those at the bottom what the reality of implementation will look like, because they're the ones who typically have to do the hard work of getting something done, that is. Here's a tricky question for you, Haley. Often with these large collaborative projects, there's a question arises very early on. What knowledge and information or information technology tools should we use?
Right. It's I think where that's often coming from is, in a sense, it's a real need, but it's also a hope that, well, if we just have the right kind of app or platform, it'll kind of do the work of collaboration for us, the same way we understand that Facebook just sort of seemed to have everybody on it at a certain point. When the reality is that the best online platforms of any sort, collaboration or otherwise, are constantly being supported, improved, new features being rolled out, and lots of human attention on what's happening in there and how to support it better. So as someone who's owning, designing, and facilitating the collaboration, if you want to introduce technology, you really have to look at that as yet another collaboration design challenge. And so one of the frameworks that we often promote in order to help sort of step back from what's the choice of tool here is we say it's people, then process, then tools. So what do the people really need, and what is the outcome they're trying to achieve? And importantly, what tools are they already using? So taking that kind of ethnographic approach of what is their life already like and what's already in their computer. And that can be especially tricky when you have multiple organizations. And then process is thinking about literally what's the business process that you're trying to support through the tool. Is it communication? Is it them giving their knowledge into a common pool of knowledge? Are they donating money? What is it you're trying to support them to get done? That will then help you choose the tool. So understanding what they're trying to get done, their constraints, and how you want them to do that.
Yeah, I would just add to that, if it's a multi-organizational setting, then to echo your point there will likely already be tools in play that will cover some element of what needs to be done, and then so people will be bringing a considerable amount of bias and even baggage into those conversations and considerations, like, wow, we tried using that one 2 years ago, it totally failed, so not interested in that, whereas maybe you're looking at a completely new environment for that. So it's very tricky. The one thing that I always try to keep in mind when it comes to technology in collaborative settings is that social proof is really what drives adoption. And what I mean by that is, like, am I going to use this? Well, it depends. Is my peers? Because my peers don't use this, it's useless. It won't do me any good at all. So so everybody's constantly looking at each other for cues as to whether or not they think they're going to use it, basically. Yeah. So start with, you can start the conversation there, and try to build shared ownership, buy-in, even excitement around a particular tool within your group is a really important factor.
And there's a whole world of strategies around getting adoption and establishing a community. And don't be afraid to fake it till you make it. So that means begging the first 10% of users to come in and just make a contribution. Get on the phone and call them and ask them to log into the online tool or to reply to the email list and be one of the first people.
Yeah, if it's a larger collaborative setting and you're reliant upon participation from people who you're not readily in contact with, say they're out in the wider community, then having a strategy for who you get to get involved and when, and who those influencers are is really very helpful. Here's a question for you, Haley, specifically because I don't always get this one right. When is the best time to celebrate success?
Well, I think it's quite simply whenever you achieve a goal. And the level of celebration can be commensurate with the level of the goal. So if it's, we got that little small deliverable out, and it's been shipped out there, then we can have a high five. One of the tips for a high five is to look at the elbow.
That was a really poor high five, mind you. Let's do that again.
Yeah, hear that ring. Well, I think celebrating success is really important because when we're there really charging at the goal, kind of doing the work, heads down, really focused, it can be really easy to feel like we're not getting anywhere. Our efforts are in vain. Collaboration so often goes slower than you expect it to go. And so it can be really easy to feel like, it's not working and we don't deserve celebration. And one of the most important factors for motivation and for sort of staying and having a good feeling is feeling like I'm making progress towards my goal. And one of the things that celebration does is create a sort of social validation that, like, yes, we did reach our goal, that was meaningful, we're getting good results, you're sharing stories that sort of prove out to each other as much as anything, as much as maybe celebrating outwardly through your newsletter or your blog post. And everyone just increases the sort of belief factor in the collaboration.
Yeah, exactly. Puts a little gas in the tank. Helps to kind of create a bright spot in the mind where you can kind of look back and going, is all this worth it? Are we getting anywhere? Oh yeah, I remember that. Yeah, we are getting somewhere. Yeah, no, I agree.
So yeah, I'm going to celebrate the fact that we just answered that question.
Yes.